My name is Leon. I am 69 years old, and I was born in Cornwall, where the sea smells of salt and kelp, and the wind can cut through your coat like a knife in the depths of winter. My parents were people of few words, but steady hearts. My father a fisherman who rose before dawn, and my mother a school secretary who kept the books neat and the teachers in line. They taught me that honesty was the marrow of a person, that resilience was not a choice but a way of surviving, and that you kept your chin up no matter how rough the tide became. I met William when I was 21 at a summer fete, his hands calloused from carpentry, and his smile carrying the kind of warmth that made you believe in home before you even stepped through a door. We married a year later in the small stone church on the hill, and for 42 years he built our life plank by plank. Each table, chair, and shelf a quiet declaration of love. We had one son, Daniel, and from the moment I first held him, squalling and red-faced, I knew my life's work would be to help him grow into the kind of man his father was. He did not take to carpentry, his mind sharper for books than for tools, but William and I encouraged him all the same, proud when he became the first in our family to earn a university degree. William's passing came quietly, a heart attack that stole him away one autumn morning while he was planing a length of oak for a customer's kitchen counter. I remember the stillness in the house after, the way the smell of sawdust lingered long after his tools were put away, and how I poured all my energy into helping Daniel, making sure he never felt alone in the world. When he met Sophie, I told myself to be grateful that he had found love, that there was someone to share his laughter and his burdens. But from the very first handshake, I knew she had already decided what she thought of me. Sophie was polite enough in front of Daniel, her voice sugared when he was near, but behind closed doors, her tone cooled, her eyes narrowed, and her patience thinned at the smallest thing. I was too neat, too chatty, too willing to help. I asked too many questions, offered too many suggestions, and occupied too much space in the home they shared. I tried to tell myself it was just a period of adjustment, that love between in-laws often needed time to find its rhythm, but deep down I knew she saw me not as family, but as a shadow in her home. Still, for Daniel's sake, I stayed gracious, swallowing the small hurts like bitter pills, never letting him see the way my hands shook sometimes after a conversation with her. I thought I could weather it, the way I had weathered every other storm in my life. But I did not yet know the wave that was coming for me. In the early days after Daniel married Sophie, I told myself that small adjustments were natural, that any family shifting to a new rhythm would find its balance in time. But the truth was that from the beginning, there were quiet undercurrents I could feel pulling me away. Sophie had a way of smiling when she spoke, her tone warm enough that no one could accuse her of malice, yet her words always seemed to steer me out of the picture. She would say things like, "We just need some time to settle in," or "You deserve a rest after all those years of looking after Daniel." And while the phrases sounded kind, they were laced with an unspoken message that I was no longer part of the inner circle. At first, it was missing a dinner here, or a weekend outing there, always explained as a spontaneous plan or an intimate moment just for the two of them. Daniel, eager to keep peace, would nod along, reassuring me that it was nothing personal, that I would be included next time, and I tried to believe him. But each time it happened, it was like watching a door slowly close, not with a slam that would make you fight to keep it open, but with the slow and quiet finality of someone who believes you will simply accept it. I remember one Sunday when they planned a trip to the coast, a tradition Daniel and I had kept since he was small, and he told me over the phone that they had already gone the day before because the weather had been so nice. His voice was cheerful, but I could hear the faint hesitation, the way people sound when they are trying to skip past the part of the story that might hurt you. I smiled through the conversation, told him I hoped they had a lovely time, and hung up to make tea in the empty kitchen, the kettle's whistle filling the silence. These moments began to gather like pebbles in my pocket, each one small enough to ignore on its own, but together they started to weigh me down. I began to notice the way Sophie's eyes flickered whenever I offered to help, the subtle pause before she declined, and how Daniel would glance at her before answering questions I directed at him. Even holiday plans, once a joy to discuss, became something I learned about after they had already been decided. I told myself I would not be the bitter mother-in-law who complained or caused trouble, that I would take what time they gave me with grace. But in the quiet moments, I could feel the distance widening, like the tide pulling away from the shore. What I did not know then was that this was not just a matter of space or adjustment. It was the first tightening of a boundary Sophie intended to draw permanently, and Daniel, without even realizing it, was already on her side of the line. The dinner was meant to be a pleasant evening, one of those formal gatherings Sophie seemed to enjoy hosting, with carefully folded napkins, polished cutlery, and a menu that looked more suited to a hotel than a family home. I wore my best navy dress, the one William always said made my eyes look brighter, and brought along a bottle of wine I had been saving for a special occasion. Sophie greeted me with a quick kiss on the cheek, her perfume sweet but a little overpowering, and ushered me into the dining room where a small group of her friends were already seated, all of them dressed as though they had stepped out of a glossy magazine. The conversation was light at first, filled with polite smiles and the clinking of glasses, until Sophie, in her usual bright voice, introduced me. "This is Leon, Daniel's mum," she said, her hand gesturing toward me as though I were an exhibit. "She potters about on her own these days." A few polite laughs followed, and I managed to smile, even chuckle softly, as though the comment rolled right off me. But inside, something sharp lodged itself in my chest. The way she said it, so casually, so publicly, stripped my life of all its weight and meaning, reducing it to something small and quaint, like a hobby someone takes up to pass the time. I glanced at Daniel, who was pouring wine into a guest's glass and didn't seem to notice, or perhaps chose not to. I kept my back straight and my voice even, making conversation about the weather, the food, the garden, anything that would steer the focus elsewhere. But the sting of those words followed me through every course. Even as I laughed along with a story one of Sophie's friends told about a disastrous holiday, I could feel it gnawing at me. This subtle reshaping of how others would see me. By dessert, I felt like a shadow at my own table, my presence acknowledged, but not truly seen. When the evening finally wound down and I gathered my coat, Sophie thanked me for coming in the same tone one might use for a neighbour who had stopped by with a casserole. Walking home, the night air was cool against my face, and I realised that while Sophie's words had been dressed in charm, they carried the same weight as a closed door. It was not an outright insult, nothing I could call her out on without looking petty, but it was a quiet declaration that in her world I was already on the periphery. I told myself it was only one comment, that perhaps I was overthinking, yet deep down I knew this was the beginning of something more deliberate, a slow erasure disguised as politeness. It started so quietly that at first I wondered if I was imagining it, those little turns of phrase Sophie would use in conversation with Daniel or in front of others, as if she were making sure I heard, but could not challenge her without seeming unreasonable. "Oh, Leanne is probably too tired for a day out," she would say with a laugh when they were discussing a trip to the coast, or, "She has her own things to do, we shouldn't trouble her," when they made plans for a Sunday lunch with friends. The first few times I brushed it off, thinking perhaps she truly believed she was sparing me the effort. But as the weeks passed, I noticed a pattern forming. The outings I had always been a part of, from simple picnics to birthday dinners, began to happen without my knowledge until after the fact. I would see the photos on social media, Daniel grinning beside Sophie, surrounded by people I had known for years, and the realization would settle in that no one had thought to call me. When I mentioned it to Daniel in passing, he looked a little sheepish and said Sophie thought I might not be up for it, as if my age was suddenly a limitation rather than a number. I wanted to tell him that I was perfectly capable, that my life had not been reduced to sitting in an armchair and knitting away the hours, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I found myself smiling politely and saying it was fine, all the while feeling like a guest who had overstayed her welcome in her own family. It was not the kind of rejection that comes in a single blow, sharp and undeniable, but the slow erosion of presence, the way the sea wears away the edge of a stone. I began to notice how Sophie's tone would shift when making plans, always framed as if she were protecting me from something, as if my inclusion was a kindness rather than a given. It was a strange sort of invisibility, being present in their lives, but only in the way a piece of furniture is present in a room, acknowledged but unchanging, expected to stay in its place. Each time an outing passed without me, I would pour myself a cup of tea, sit at the kitchen table, and tell myself I was imagining it, that there would be another chance. But the truth was hard to ignore, and I could feel the space between us widening, not in the loud way of slammed doors or sharp words, but in the quiet way of invitations never sent. It was a slow push toward the edges, wrapped in soft words and false concern. And I knew if I did not pay attention, one day I might find myself completely outside their circle. When Sophie called that morning, her voice unusually warm, I almost wondered if she had dialed me by mistake. She said she thought we should have a chat, just the two of us, to clear the air, and suggested meeting at the little cafe in town with the green awning and the mismatched chairs. It was the first time in years she had invited me anywhere without Daniel present, and for a moment I hesitated, my mind running over all the possible reasons. Part of me wanted to say no, to protect myself from whatever subtle sting might be waiting, but there was another part that still clung to the hope that maybe we could find some common ground. I dressed with care, choosing my soft blue cardigan and a string of pearls William had given me on our 10th anniversary, thinking that perhaps a little grace might help set the tone. The walk into town felt longer than usual, each step accompanied by a mixture of nerves and quiet optimism. The cafe smelled of fresh coffee and warm pastries, and sunlight spilled through the windows, casting a soft glow over the worn wooden tables. Sophie was already there, her hair perfectly smooth, her blouse crisp, a small smile on her face that I could not quite read. She stood to greet me, leaning in for a polite kiss on the cheek, and gestured toward the table she had chosen in the corner, away from the other customers. I sat down, wrapping my hands around the menu more for something to do than from any real need to read it, and she launched into small talk about the weather, the new shops opening on the high street, and Daniel's latest work project. I waited for her to get to the heart of why we were there, my mind catching on the word she had used on the phone, truce, and wondering if she truly meant it. At one point she reached across the table, her nails neatly painted a pale pink, and said she knew we had had our differences, but she wanted to move past them for the sake of the family. Her eyes held mine, steady, but not entirely warm, as if she were gauging my reaction. I nodded and told her I agreed, that it would be good for all of us to find a way forward, and for a brief moment it felt almost natural, like two women simply sharing an afternoon coffee. Still, there was a tension beneath the surface, something unspoken that prickled at the edges of the conversation. And I left the cafe that day with a strange mix of relief and caution, unsure if I had been extended an olive branch or handed a carefully wrapped warning. The clink of porcelain on wood was a small sound, but in that moment it felt louder than the low murmur of the other customers and the gentle hum of the coffee machine. Sophie had ordered for us both, insisting she knew exactly what I would like, and I had smiled politely, though I usually preferred to choose for myself. She sat across from me, her posture perfect, her hands folded neatly in her lap as though she were hosting a formal meeting rather than sharing a casual drink. When the waitress approached, her tray balanced with 2 cups, I caught a fleeting glance in her eyes, a flicker of something I could not name. She placed Sophie's cappuccino down first, then leaned closer as she set my tea before me, her voice dropping to a breath only I could hear. "Do not drink it," she whispered, the words quick and almost trembling. And before I could even react, she straightened, turned, and walked briskly away. I sat frozen for a heartbeat, my fingers resting lightly on the saucer, my mind struggling to catch up to what had just happened. Sophie was speaking again, something about Daniel's work trip next month, but her voice seemed distant, muffled, as if I were underwater. I glanced down at the tea, steam curling upward in soft spirals, and suddenly the delicate floral aroma felt sharp in my nose, almost bitter. My heart began to thud, slow at first, then faster, and I forced my gaze back to Sophie, studying the slight curve of her smile, the way her eyes did not quite meet mine. She reached for her spoon, stirring her cappuccino with leisurely grace, as though nothing in the world could disturb her calm. I told myself to breathe, to keep my face composed, to give away nothing until I understood what game I might have stumbled into. The warmth from the cup seeped into my palms, a contrast to the sudden chill in my chest, and every instinct in me screamed to push it away. Instead, I set it gently back on the table, folding my hands in front of me, my mind a swirl of questions that had no safe place to land. Across the room, the waitress moved between tables with practiced ease, but every so often her gaze flicked toward me, sharp and deliberate, as if to be sure I had understood her warning. I could feel the air between Sophie and me change, subtle but undeniable, like the faint shift in wind before a storm rolls in. I smiled faintly, as though lost in thought, and asked her about her family, buying myself time while the untouched tea sat cooling in front of me. Inside, however, the ground beneath me had shifted, and I knew with a clarity that settled deep in my bones that this afternoon was not about reconciliation at all. It was about something far darker. The words clung to me like damp cloth, heavy and impossible to ignore. And no matter how much I tried to focus on Sophie's pleasant tone, they echoed over and over in my head, the waitress's quick whisper repeating itself until I could almost feel her breath again against my ear. My heart pounded in my chest, loud enough that I was certain Sophie could hear it, though she remained perfectly at ease, sipping her cappuccino as though the afternoon were nothing more than a polite catch-up between family. I looked at the tea in front of me, its surface still and unbroken, the steam curling upward in soft, delicate ribbons, betraying nothing of what might linger beneath. It looked harmless, inviting even, and yet I felt as though I were staring into something quietly treacherous. I told myself to breathe slowly, to keep my hands still on my lap, to not so much as flick my eyes toward the waitress in case it drew attention. My instincts told me that the smallest shift, the faintest crack in my expression, would give me away. Sophie's voice was smooth, her words winding through trivial topics about Daniel's work and the weather, but every syllable felt like it was meant to lull me into comfort. My mind ran through possibilities with the speed of a river after heavy rain. Had I misheard? Was this a mistake? A misunderstanding? A cruel joke? Or had Sophie, with her poised smile and careful manner, truly done what the waitress claimed? The temptation to push the cup away was almost unbearable, yet I knew that if I recoiled too quickly, I would confirm I had been warned. I had spent decades reading people, learning the subtleties of their pauses and glances, and now every movement Sophie made felt deliberate, as if she too were measuring me. I lifted my hand and touched the edge of the saucer, not to drink, but to appear as though I might. My fingers trembled just enough that I hoped she would think it the harmless sign of age. I let my eyes soften, as if distracted by the flowers in the vase behind her, willing my heartbeat to slow, while inside it was battering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I knew I had to outlast her in this unspoken standoff, to act as though I were still blind to the possibility of harm, even as my senses sharpened to every sound and movement in the room. The tea cooled slowly between us, a silent witness to the tension that now filled the space, and I realized with a cold certainty that whatever Sophie's true intentions were, this was not the time to confront them. I had been given a warning, and I would carry it quietly for now, holding my composure like a shield, while my mind began preparing for the long game ahead. I forced a small, easy smile, and let my voice drift into the kind of polite chatter one might hear between two women idly passing the time, asking Sophie about her new garden plants, about the holiday she had mentioned in passing, about things that could not possibly hold weight, but were safe enough to fill the air. My mind was far from the words, watching instead for the slightest ripple in her expression. The tea sat between us like an unspoken challenge, the steam now fading, and I told myself I could not leave it there untouched for too long without drawing her attention. When the waitress passed by again, I seized the moment with a casual gesture, smiling up at her as though nothing in the world could be wrong, and asked if I might try a different blend, saying something about my stomach being delicate with certain leaves. The lie came easily, soft as lace, but I saw the tiniest shift in Sophie's posture, the faint arch of her brow, the pause before she looked back down at her spoon. I knew I had to keep my own face calm, my tone airy, as though the request were no more than whimsy. The waitress nodded, her eyes meeting mine with the briefest flicker of understanding, and soon the questionable cup was gone, replaced with one I saw poured directly from a fresh pot at the counter. I wrapped my hands around the new cup, letting the warmth seep into my palms, and sipped slowly, while continuing our conversation. All the while, I studied her. The way her eyes would dart briefly toward me before glancing away, the way her smile stayed fixed, but no longer quite reached her eyes, told me more than her words ever could. She spoke about Daniel, about his long hours at work, about the pressures they both faced, and there was a faint undertone in her voice, as though she wanted to remind me of her place beside him. I listened and nodded, occasionally laughing at something light she said, keeping the rhythm of the talk steady so she could not see where my mind had truly gone. I thought of the years I had weathered storms far worse than this, the times I had been underestimated, dismissed, or quietly pushed aside, and I knew that patience could be as sharp as any blade. If Sophie had truly tried to harm me, she would not get the satisfaction of seeing me flinch or falter. I would take this moment and fold it away, keeping it safe until the day I chose to open it again. As she stirred the last of her coffee, her spoon clinking against the porcelain, I caught that flicker in her eyes once more, quick and unguarded, the smallest admission that she had not expected me to sidestep so neatly, It was in that look I found my confirmation, and in my quiet composure I found my strength. When Sophie finally stood, smoothing her coat and offering a smile that felt like it had been practiced in a mirror, I rose too, matching her politeness with my own. We exchanged the usual parting phrases, the kind that meant nothing, yet were meant to fill the space until the next time. She walked away down the narrow street, her heels clicking against the cobblestones, and I remained by the table for a moment longer, letting my breath settle. The air in the cafe felt warmer now, quieter, the kind of stillness that comes after a storm has passed, but the scent of rain still lingers. I was gathering my bag when the waitress returned, her eyes darting toward the door Sophie had just exited before she leaned closer to me. Her voice was low, careful, but there was no hesitation when she said she had seen Sophie take something from her handbag and pour it into my tea. She told me she could not say what it was, only that it had been quick and deliberate, and that something in her gut told her it was wrong. For a moment, I simply looked at her, the weight of her words settling into me like stones into water, rippling out in every direction. I thanked her, and the gratitude in my voice came from a place so deep I felt it in my chest. There are moments in life when a single act, even from a stranger, changes the path of your day, perhaps even your life, and this was one of them. I reached for her hand and gave it a light squeeze, feeling the calluses on her palm that told of long hours on her feet, of work done without complaint. She gave a small nod, as if to say it had been nothing, yet I knew that speaking up could not have been easy. People so often look away, convincing themselves they have misunderstood, that it is not their place to interfere, but she had chosen otherwise. As she moved away to tend to another table, I sat back down for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, and let the truth of what might have been wash over me. I could not yet name the substance or the intention, but I knew in my bones that danger had been near, close enough to taste in the steam that had risen from that cup. The thought was unsettling, but alongside it came a quiet resolve, the kind that tightens your spine and steadies your breathing. I stepped out into the cool afternoon air with a different sense of the day, carrying not only the knowledge of what had almost happened, but also the reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of courage come from people who expect nothing in return. I walked away with a quiet gratitude that settled in my chest like a light in the dark, certain that I would not forget her face. When I returned home, the familiar creak of the front door and the faint scent of lavender polish on the hallway table felt strangely comforting, as if the walls themselves knew I needed steadiness. I set my bag down and stood in the kitchen for a while, the hum of the fridge filling the silence as my mind replayed the afternoon in loops. Sophie's smile, the way her fingers lingered near my cup, the flicker in her eyes when I ordered a second tea, all of it seemed sharper now, the colours brighter in memory than they had been in the moment. I began thinking back over the years, combing through the smaller things I had once brushed aside as awkwardness or forgetfulness. The casserole she insisted on bringing over when I had been ill that tasted faintly bitter, the glass of wine she poured at Christmas that made me dizzy after a single sip, the time she persuaded Daniel to keep me home from a trip because she said I looked pale, even though I had felt perfectly fine. At the time, I had told myself it was my own mind spinning stories, that mistrust was an ugly habit, but in the quiet of my kitchen, those moments began arranging themselves into a pattern I could no longer ignore. I sat at the table with my laptop, the glow of the screen lighting my hands as I typed searches I never thought I would need to make. Words like tampering with food or drink, proof of poisoning, and legal process for evidence. My stomach knotted at the sight of official guidelines, yet I read every word carefully, determined not to move without knowledge. I wrapped the cafe cup in a sealed bag, the faint ring of tea at the bottom holding a weight far greater than its size, and wrote the date and time in my neatest handwriting across the label. I knew I could take it to a private lab, have it tested quietly, keep the results until I was ready. The kettle clicked off behind me, the rush of steam fogging the window above the sink, and I thought about how many cups of tea I had poured in my life, each one an offering of comfort, never once considering it could be turned into something dangerous. The thought of Sophie, with her carefully chosen words and her delicate way of touching her hair, planning something so quietly, made my hands tighten on the edge of the table. I told myself that if she had crossed this line, then I would no longer play the role of the quiet mother-in-law in the corner. I would meet her calculation with my own, not out of vengeance, but out of self-preservation, because I had given too much of my life to be treated as disposable. That night, as the wind shifted outside and the sound of the sea reached my window in gentle waves, I decided that proof would be my anchor, and once I had it, nothing she said could pull me under again. When the email arrived, its subject line plain and unassuming, my heart still managed to stumble in my chest as though it already knew what it would say. I clicked it open slowly, as if dragging out those few seconds could delay the truth from settling into my bones. The words blurred at first, my eyes skimming them without letting them land, until the phrase, "trace amounts of a sedative compound," caught hold and refused to let go. My hand tightened around the mouse, and for a long moment I simply stared at the screen, the black text stark against the white, feeling as if someone had drawn a straight, cold line through all my doubts. I had thought I might still be wrong, that perhaps the waitress had misunderstood, that perhaps Sophie had only been careless, but this was proof in the clean, clinical language of a lab report. A sedative, deliberately placed in the cup I had been about to drink from. I felt an odd stillness in my body, as though my mind was moving, but my limbs had been left behind. My breath slow and deliberate, like I was keeping pace with an invisible tide. It was not rage that rose first, nor even fear, but a grim kind of clarity, the sort that strips away all the softness and leaves only the shape of the truth. I thought of Daniel, of his smile when he was small, of the way his hand used to reach for mine without thinking, and I realized that telling him would not be as simple as showing him this report. Sophie had been weaving herself into his trust for years, and any sudden accusation from me would be met with disbelief, or worse, pity. I closed the laptop and rested my palm on the smooth lid, the hum of its cooling fan fading away, until the only sound in the room was the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. I knew I could not rush this. Every step forward had to be steady, deliberate, the way one walks across a frozen pond, testing the ground with each shift of weight. I would keep the report safe, print multiple copies, store them where they could not be easily touched. Sophie might think of herself as clever, but I had lived through enough storms to know that patience is its own weapon. I made tea, the ordinary act feeling strange now, the hiss of the kettle sharp in my ears. As I poured the water and watched it swirl around the leaves, I thought of how close I had come to drinking what she had intended for me, and the knowledge settled deep inside me like a stone at the bottom of a well. I would protect myself. I would protect my son. And I would do it in such a way that Sophie would never see the moment I slipped the ground out from under her feet. I sat across from Mr. Hargreaves in his quiet little office, the smell of polished wood and old paper wrapping around us like a memory from another time. He had been my solicitor for more than 20 years, through the sale of William's workshop, the purchase of my cottage, and even Daniel's first home. And I trusted him in a way I did not trust many. I told him everything, my voice steady, though my hands curled around the handle of my handbag like it was a lifeline. I described the cafe meeting, the waitress's warning, the way Sophie's eyes had flickered when I swapped the tea, and finally the results of the lab test. His face barely moved as he listened, but I noticed the slight narrowing of his eyes and the way he set his pen down with deliberate care, as if weighing every word that would follow. When I slid the printed report across the desk, he glanced at it once, then again more slowly, before leaning back in his chair and folding his hands. We spoke in the language of quiet strategy, each sentence deliberate, as though the walls themselves might carry sound to the wrong ears. The plan was not one of confrontation, but of insulation, a way to fortify the edges of my life so that Sophie could not reach what mattered most. We discussed securing my bank accounts with additional safeguards, rewriting sections of my will, and ensuring that my property could not be altered or sold without my explicit consent. He advised me to begin keeping a written record of every interaction with Sophie, no matter how small, noting times, dates, and her exact words. I felt the weight of the conversation settle into me, heavy, but also strangely reassuring, like fitting a lock to a door that had been left open for too long. Mr. Hargreaves assured me that we would move quietly, each step invisible until it needed to be seen. As he spoke, I realized this was not just about Sophie's attempt in the cafe. It was about reclaiming the control I had allowed to slip away in the name of family harmony. We finalized the first steps, signatures crisp on fresh paper, the scratch of the pen loud in the otherwise hushed room. When I left his office, the afternoon air felt sharper, the pale winter sun catching on the frost along the pavement. I tucked the folder tightly under my arm, feeling as though I carried both a shield and a sword in one. The danger had not passed, but now I was no longer standing in the open waiting for it to come. I was moving first, with the patience of a tide that knows it will wear down even the strongest stone. I sat at my kitchen table that morning, the weak winter light spilling across the pages before me, and felt the kind of clarity that only comes when you have finally stopped waiting for someone else to change. The folder from Mr. Hargreaves lay open, neat and precise. Every clause and paragraph, a quiet boundary drawn in black ink. We went through it together in his office just yesterday, but now I read it alone, my tea untouched beside me, knowing this was not simply paperwork. It was the map of the life I was choosing to protect. Daniel would still inherit the bulk of my estate, but only if certain conditions were met, conditions designed to keep Sophie's hands far from anything that bore my name. There were stipulations about trust accounts, about independent oversight, and about the fact that my home could never be sold without my express approval, even if I was gone. I also set aside a considerable portion for causes that had shaped me over the years. The hospice that cared for William in his final weeks. The library in the village where I had spent rainy afternoons with Daniel when he was small, and a foundation for elderly people living alone who needed small but meaningful help to keep their independence. Sophie's name appeared nowhere. Not in the will, not in the powers of attorney, not even in the emergency contact lists I updated alongside it. It was as if she had been written out of my life in the same deliberate way she had tried to write me out of Daniel's. Signing those pages felt both heavy and light, like setting down a burden I had carried too long and picking up a shield in the same motion. I thought of the generations before me, my mother, who would have called this putting your house in order. And I realized that is exactly what I was doing, tidying the edges so there would be no loose threads for Sophie to pull at. When I sealed the documents in the large brown envelope to return to Mr. Hargreaves, I paused for a moment, pen in hand, and wrote my name across it with steady strokes. It was not spite that guided me, though I would have been forgiven if it were. It was the knowledge that my life and the things I had built were mine to place where they could do good, not to be left in the hands of someone who would treat them as spoils. The kettle clicked off in the background, the sound startling me slightly, and I realized the tea had gone cold. I poured it away, rinsed the cup, and stood at the sink for a moment, the water rushing over my hands. In that quiet, I understood that this was not an ending, but a line drawn in the sand, and I was finally standing on the side that was mine. When Daniel arrived that afternoon, the air between us was polite but cautious, the way it often is when neither person knows how the conversation will end. I had set the table with tea and shortbread, the ordinary rituals that used to mean comfort, though now they felt like stage dressing for something heavier. The envelope sat in the center, cream paper and sealed with the neat press of my thumb. I told him it was for him to read here, not to take away, and that I would be in the kitchen while he did. He frowned, curiosity drawing a faint crease between his brows, and I could see in the way he hesitated that part of him already knew this was not going to be something he could dismiss with a laugh or a shrug. From the kitchen doorway I watched as he broke the seal, his eyes skimming the test results first, then slowing when he reached my written account of the cafe afternoon. I had written it carefully, not as an accusation, but as a record, every word deliberate. The same way you might note the details of a storm, so no one could later say it was just a bit of drizzle. When he reached the final page, the changes to my will, his expression shifted, tightening as the weight of it settled in. His mouth opened once, as if to speak, then closed again, and the silence between us deepened until I could hear the faint ticking of the clock above the mantel. I stood very still, my hands resting on the edge of the counter, giving him space to absorb it without interruption. He looked up at me then, his eyes wide, and for a moment I saw the boy he used to be, the one who would run to me with a grazed knee or a broken toy, trusting that I could make it right. This time, though, I knew I could not make it right for him, because to do so would mean unmaking the boundaries I had built to protect myself. He slid the papers back into the envelope slowly, almost reverently, as if handling something fragile. His voice was low when he finally spoke, asking if it was all true, and I told him it was, every word. There was no shouting, no accusations hurled across the table, just a stillness that seemed to stretch and hold us both in its grip. In his eyes I saw the flicker of realization, not only of what Sophie had done, but of the fact that he had not seen it, or perhaps had not wanted to. I did not move toward him, and he did not move toward me. Yet in that unspoken moment, something between us shifted, not back to what it had been, but into the truth, bare and unpolished. It was months later when I realized I no longer saw Sophie's name appear on my phone or heard her clipped voice in the background when Daniel called. I never asked him what had happened between them, and he never volunteered the details, which suited me just fine. Some truths do not need to be spoken aloud to be understood. My days found a different rhythm, one that belonged entirely to me. I rose when the light began to spill across the garden, the air still cool and damp, and I would walk among the rows of roses and lavender, touching each bloom as if greeting an old friend. The grass felt softer underfoot, and the birdsong seemed clearer, as if the absence of tension had widened the air. I began to bake again, the smell of warm bread drifting through the open windows, and I filled my calendar not with obligations I dreaded, but with visits from friends who had stood by me through the quiet storm. I learned that peace was not the absence of noise, but the presence of safety, a calm that settled in your bones when you no longer had to look over your shoulder. Daniel came by more often, sometimes to share a meal, sometimes just to sit in the kitchen with a mug of tea while the rain tapped against the windows. There were still shadows in his eyes, but there was also something softer, as if the walls between us had begun to crumble. I kept the truth close, not as a weapon, but as a shield, a reminder that I had chosen to protect myself without seeking to destroy anyone else. It was my silence, deliberate and steady, that had done the work for me, letting the truth reveal itself without my hand forcing it into the light. I tended my garden in the same way, patient and consistent, knowing that roots grow stronger when left undisturbed. The memory of that day in the cafe still visited me from time to time, but it no longer tightened my chest or set my thoughts racing. Instead, it came like an old chapter in a book I had already finished, something that had shaped me, but no longer defined me. I understood now that victory did not always arrive with applause or grand declarations. Sometimes it was simply waking each day with a steady heart, free from the sharp edges of someone else's malice. Sophie had removed herself from my life, and in doing so, she had given me back my space, my quiet, and my dignity. I stood in the garden one late afternoon, the sky painted gold, and I thought of how far I had come. The truth had been my armor, but it was my silence that had been the sharpest blade, carving a path toward a life that was wholly mine.